So last night over dinner, I told my kids about the decision that I'm sharing with you today. I intend to resign as party leader, as prime minister, after the party selects its next leader through a robust, nationwide, competitive process.
Yes, that was the outgoing Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, who yesterday announced that he was off after a 9-year tenure. So does his departure complete the global vibe shift? Will Canada now become the 51st state in all but name? Donald Trump has not even been sworn in for his second term, and already the fact of his election seems to be rearranging the global map, like resetting a chess match. We haven't done actually very much on Canada on this show, but the only person who I would trust to put it into context for us is long-term friend of the show, the investor, economist, macro-political observer, and of course Canadian resident, Louis-Vincent Gave. Welcome, Louis. So let me start with this question. Why is Justin Trudeau so hated on the political right, but not just in Canada, but pretty much around the world? Why? How did that happen?
You know what they said when he had to make his resignation speech yesterday? They said that the best part about his speech was that he had to give it twice. He had to give it once in English and again in French. And that brought so much joy to probably at this stage about 80% of Canadians. So to your point, why is he so hated? It's not just the right. I think he's hated first and foremost because he betrayed the very core foundations of his own party. You know, his party is called the Liberal Party. And everything he has done since he came to power was basically to undermine individual liberty, undermine individual freedom. And the biggest example of this, which I think ranked really particularly badly with everyone, was using the power of the state to crush the protesting truckers. Do you remember in the heights of COVID, truckers did a big demonstration leaving from Western Canada, going all the way to Ottawa. He blocked their insurance. He blocked their bank accounts. He debanked, anybody who gave money to support the truckers. Now, can you think of any more illiberal measure than this?
So you would count that then as a major turning point in his premiership. Yeah, that's what I hear a lot. And it certainly felt like that, observing from afar. That was somehow a line was crossed when the bank accounts of truck drivers were frozen because they were protesting. That felt very tyrannical.
Remember, it wasn't just the truck drivers. It was people who donated money to the truck drivers. So you had stories of, single working moms, waitresses who wired $20 to help the truck drivers, and they found their bank accounts frozen. And this for 6 months until the Canadian Supreme Court had to basically say, look, this is unconstitutional, and the governments can't do this. But can you think of a more illiberal measure than a government targeting its own population without due process, without rule of law, without anything? It was basically declaring war on your own people. And yes, Trudeau had been reelected. When that happened, he'd been reelected 14 or 15 months before. It had been essentially a nothing election in the midst of COVID. He won partly because he gave massive handouts, but it was a fairly unconvincing election. He was forced to go into coalition with the NDP, but the level of hatred wasn't there. Following the truckers, all of a sudden, he found himself in a situation where not only did he start to lose every by-election, not by a little, but by a landslide. The Liberal Party lost seats that, hadn't been competitive for 50 years. It marked a watershed. And all of a sudden, Trudeau couldn't just, Canadians are very nice people, very polite, and not very politically driven. It's not like the United States where politics really divide the population, or it's even less political than the UK. It's like people just get on with it and don't really care about politics. But then all of a sudden, Trudeau couldn't go out for dinner without getting insulted in the street, which is completely un-Canadian, completely un-Canadian. So that was a real turning point.
What else is there on the charge sheet then, I guess? Because I would share your observation that COVID era, and not just the truckers, the overreach, the restrictions were very draconian, and he really kind of fell down that trap as badly as others. But what else?
So I think when you look at Canada, perhaps the best way you can think of it is think of all the problems that the UK has and make it worse. In that the Canadian economy really hasn't grown very much at all in 10 years, except thanks to one thing. It's grown massively thanks to immigration. So if you look at GDP, there's been no growth in productivity, and it's just been growth of population. Not through births, through immigration. Now, in turn, this has led to a housing crisis where you have massive housing shortages because you've just shipped in literally millions of 20 to 40-year-old people from all over the world. Now, Canada was, of course, always built on immigration, but the pace of it has increased dramatically. So you've got this odd situation where if you look at the past 10 years, basically GDP per capita in Canada has actually gone down. So most people feel poor, but they're told, oh, look, your GDP is bigger. So you have the same situation as Britain, where you have a backlash against immigration, except immigration's been bigger in Canada than it has in the United Kingdom. And you have the same backlash against essentially unaffordable housing. And so now you're stuck in a situation where housing is super expensive. It basically has taken over the entire balance sheet of anybody between 20 and 50 years old. Housing needs to come down. Housing is coming down, and immigration has to stop. Now, the one big turning point for Trudeau was 6 months ago. He said, okay, we're done with immigration, and we're going to not renew all the immigration visas. We're going to send people back. So now you're in a situation where for the next 2 years, population in Canada is actually going to shrink. Real estate is going to roll over, and all this against a backdrop where the currency falls every day. The currency falls every day because inflation is a real problem at home, and inflation is a kryptonite of political careers. Inflation is a real problem, but the central bank actually can't hike rates. If they hike rates, the real estate bubble implodes. So you got this catch-22 where your currency goes down, inflation goes up, but you're beholden to a real estate bubble. It's very much like the UK, except bigger.
There's one thing we haven't mentioned, which is environmental policies. It's starting to sound very similar to what we've been talking about, in the UK, in Europe, all around the world. You can almost think of Trudeau as a kind of classic member of a particular generation of politics and of politicians who viewed what the world should look like in a certain way. It was the Obama era and the years after. And high immigration, and of course, green or net zero or those kind of policies. There was a big carbon tax, wasn't there, in Canada? I looked at a Guardian piece today that said it was still very popular. Is that true?
No, the carbon tax is massively unpopular. Look, I think when you've got fast rising inflation, when people can't make ends meet, and you come on top of it and you say, hey, we're going to increase your heating bill. And by the way, heating bills are a big deal in Canada. It's cold here. When you tell them we're going to increase your heating bill, we're going to increase your gasoline bill, and people drive big trucks here. It's not like the UK where you drive little cars. There's proper weather here. You don't want to be in a small hatchback in a snowstorm. When you tell all these people we're going to increase your energy cost to save the planet, frankly, it goes at a time when people are already squeezed. It goes down like a lead balloon. Now, to your point on the green energy policies of the past decade, etc., I think all these energy policies were done at a time where, frankly, we could afford to be stupid. The reality of our economies is economic activity is energy transformed. And 10 years ago, policymakers all over the Western world, call them Macron, call them Boris Johnson, call them Obama, call them Trudeau, came in and said, you know what, I'm going to make energy more expensive because I want a virtue signal, because I want to pat myself on the back and look good at international congresses. So I'm going to make energy more expensive for you, the end user. And in so doing, I'm going to kill the productivity of my economy.
And so the carbon tax that he introduced directly increases the price of energy.
Taxes increase costs. It's just as 2 plus 2 equals 4. For Canada to do this, of all places, Canada is a carbon superpower. They have coal, they have natural gas, they have oil. Everything should be done to help these industries. If Canada has one comparative advantage, it is in natural resource extraction. Companies from all over the world are happy to invest in Canada because you have essentially British law, you have rights of property.
Unless your bank is blocked by the government, that is.
Well, so that was one big shift. But by and large, if your choice, if you're Shell and your choice is I can invest in Equatorial Guinea or Canada sounds better. That's going to be still what you're going to do. But to your point, if you have a government that trips you up every step of the way, you just sit back and you don't do it. Why do you want to come in as a natural resource extractor to a country where the government spits in your face day in, day out?
What's interesting talking to you as opposed to talking to a political pundit is that you're looking at the economics of it. And actually, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? Because a lot of the analysis at the moment of this so-called rightward turn and the world is suddenly like in some crazy right-wing reverie and everyone's going wild. It's actually just they're feeling poor in a lot of these countries. They are feeling less rich than they used to be. And the policies of the past 10 or even 20 years, they blame for that. So they want to change things. Is it that simple?
I think it is. Look, we've had 10 years, whether from the right or from the left, of virtue signaling and of economic policies that were frankly asinine, and especially energy policies that were asinine. I've been doing emerging markets for 25 years, and one of the early lessons you learn when you do emerging markets is that when a situation goes from being really, really bad to even just mediocre, you go from really, really bad to mediocre, there's actually good money to be made. Now, one clear example of this was Argentina this year. Talking of this rightward shift, in comes Milei, slashing government, slashing regulations, and all of a sudden investors feel, what? I feel confident enough that I'm not going to get the rug pulled from under my feet, so I can redeploy capital here. And just this, you get a massive re-rating of assets. Last year, the Argentinian stock and bond markets were the best performing in the world. So when you look at Canada, this is a country that, again, has, along with Australia, probably the most obvious comparative advantage when it comes to commodities. And it's not even close. They can produce anything at a decent price. And especially now that the Canadian dollar is, decently cheap, it's fallen pretty hard. And so now you're any kind of natural resource company in the world, you see that Pierre Poilievre is going to come in. You know that he's from Alberta. You know that he's pro-energy. You know that he's pro-natural resources. All of a sudden you feel like instead of having a government that's going to spit in my eye, I've got a government that's going to be supporting me. So at the very least, I should be looking at, what's the low-hanging fruit here? The stuff that should have been done 10 years ago, 5 years ago, but people passed on simply because of the, natural resource companies aren't in the business of fighting politicians. It's just like, what's the upside of that? Just move on to the next thing.
You've got there before I even asked it, but tell us a little bit more about Pierre Poilievre. So it's around about twice as many people, according to the polls, look like they might vote for Poilievre than the Liberal Party at the moment. Of course, that could change, but he looks like he has a very substantial advantage. Who is he? What kind of conservative is he? Is he a kind of classical liberal? Is he a Trumpian protectionist? What kind of guy is Poilievre?
I don't think he's a Trumpian protectionist, no. So first, before we go there, I think there's something important is that Trudeau has been so bad that he probably will end up destroying the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party may cease to exist at this forthcoming election. It's a party that was created in 1867 and that has been in power more than any other party in Canada. Now, if you have less than 8 MPs, I think it's 8 or 10, I can't remember, you're not an official party anymore. So we could see, just like the Socialist Party in France imploded after Hollande, I think the Liberal Party is going to implode. So the official, if you look at the polls, the official opposition party could very well end up being the Bloc Québécois. It'd be like, imagine if Labour botched it up so badly that the SNP became the
Scottish nationalists.
Scottish nationalists became the official opposition party to the Tories. This is where we might be heading in Canada.
So just to be clear, you think Poilievre is going to win?
Oh, he's going to blow it out. He's going to blow it out. But he's going to have 4 years essentially without an opposition party. Essentially. To your question, I think he's a traditional sort of right-wing conservative of the Conservative Party. He comes from Alberta. Perhaps to put it in terms people can understand, Alberta is sort of the Texas of Canada, oil producing, very right wing. Now, a lot of the Conservative Party in Canada is not very conservative at all. But, a couple of them did stand up for the truckers. He was one of them. Leslyn Lewis was another. And that's really it. And that's when he made his name, to be honest. When he stood up, he went to meet with the truckers, he marched with them.
So what does a Poilievre-led Canada look like? Presumably greater controls on immigration, we would expect. Attempts to reduce the size of the state? Is he that kind of conservative? Is he going to go like Elon Musk, looking to halve the size of the federal budget?
If you listen to him, yes. I mean, whenever he's asked about inflation, he always says, look, the problem with inflation is excess government spending. Government spending has increased a lot under this Liberal administration over the past 10 years. His argument is, there's been a lot of new programs that could be cut back. There's low-hanging fruit. Now, interestingly, what he talks about isn't as much cutting government spending, but that any increase in government spending has to be met with $1 of saving somewhere else. So you want a new $1 for this, you got to take $1 from somewhere else. We can expect the end of the carbon tax, which will be a relief. We can expect indeed much lower immigration, which should mean lower growth. Another big part of his platform is dramatic cutback in regulations on construction and basically building of real estate.
Is he a social conservative? One of the policies that was really striking and observers from overseas were really focusing on was this assisted dying trend in Canada. I think we can call it a trend because by some accounts, as many as 5% of people last year died via the assisted dying program. So it's really a kind of world leader. A lot of social conservatives, people who feel like that is kind of liberal ideas misapplied and gone wrong, were really horrified by that. Do you think there'll be a kind of correction on those things in a Poilievre world, or is he more of a kind of libertarian?
I think Canadian conservatives naturally shy away from discussing social issues because one of the things in Canada is you don't want to be called an American. You don't want to be tarred with that brush. So as soon as you start discussing abortion, euthanasia, rights to bear arms, etc., immediately it's like, there you are, you're Trump or you're an American, etc. I think, to be honest, his plate will be full enough with economic issues. He knows full well that he's going to come in with a landslide. Does he use that landslide to deal with social issues or economic issues? If he deals with social issue, he might not get reelected. That will be his fear at the back of his mind. If he deals with economic issues and basically manages to stop the inflation, manages to stop the Canadian dollar from falling, because the Canadian dollar from falling, incidentally, I'll just throw that's a political issue in itself. Most Canadians, as much as they brag about, sucking up through the winter, etc., they want to go to Florida, they want to go to Hawaii, they want to go to Arizona for the winter. And when the loonie is at 140, then they can't afford to go to Florida.
But how does that play out with the new Trump administration? I mean, 2 weeks from now, we'll have President Trump back. He's been talking about tariffs. Is it trolling? Is it joking? He's referring to Canada as the 51st state. Maybe they want to come inside the club. How will that relationship play out if Poilievre wins?
Trump dislikes Trudeau. And so he loves trolling Trudeau. He loves bashing Trudeau. When Poilievre comes in, I'd expect an improvement in the relationship. Ideologically, they share a lot of the same common points.
But tariffs, for example?
Well, so here's the interesting thing is aside from the auto industry, pretty much everything the U.S. imports from Canada is commodities. It's timber, it's copper, it's iron ore, it's energy in one form or another. So does Trump really want to increase tariffs on commodities and make U.S. industry less competitive? I mean, the whole Trump point is to make America great again, to build industry in the U.S., build industrial jobs. You can't do that if you increase the cost of the commodities coming in.
So you think there may not be such tariffs on the northern border, at least?
I don't think it'll be that big a deal. Because, like the energy, the heavy crude that the U.S. buys from Canada, etc. Like the U.S. needs. Like if they want to put a higher price on it, so be it. But I'm not sure how that helps the United States.
I'm going to ask you to zoom out even more. We've gone from Canada to the whole of North America. Now I want a bit of a global view. This rightward shift, which is usually talked about, analysed in purely sociological, political, culture war terms, to be honest. Tell us about the economics of this. I mean, if all of these countries across the West start following a similar playbook, trying to reduce their deficits, cutting out self-harming green policies, reducing the price of energy, etc., what sort of effect would it have on the economy? Are we facing a boom times decade?
Look, retrenchment in government as an investor, I think that's usually pretty good news. If we're seeing a wave of deregulation, that's usually pretty good news. If we're seeing a wave of attempting not to make energy costs more expensive, but to make energy costs cheaper, that's terrific news. Yeah, I mean, look, I've got my own right-wing biases that I'll happily disclose. But if what you're describing to me is a future of more deregulation, cheaper energy, etc., all happy days. Now, there is one big question mark over all of this is the tariff question, is the free trade question. Because while we're talking deregulation, at the same time, we're talking tariffs, at least in the United States. And so there's an internal contradiction here because tariffs means more government involvement, not less. So this is why I think, one of the bigger questions of the next 6 months is what does Trump really do with the tariffs? Is he using the tariffs as a threat to basically get a better deal and move things forward? Or are the tariffs the end goal? Now, when you look in the Trump universe, there's different people whispering in his ears. You've got a Robert Lighthizer who has been frozen out of the administration, but somebody like Robert Lighthizer say, look, free trade's been a disaster for the United States. We need to have high trade barriers and bring industry back to the U.S. Now, if you do that, that means lower returns on invested capital for everybody. It means, higher inflation for everybody. I can't see how that'd be good news. Then you got guys like Scott Bessent, as incoming Treasury Secretary, who say, look, what we need is to tell the Japanese, the Chinese to revalue their currencies, bring down their trade surpluses, and invest more in the United States. Now, if a deal like that is done, something akin to the Plaza Accord of 1985, something that Scott Bessent himself calls the Mar-a-Lago Accord, if you move to a Mar-a-Lago Accord, well then, look at what happened post-85 when we did the Plaza Accord. When you had the Plaza Accord, the world boomed. You had a 2-year super strong growth. Stock markets doubled and tripled everywhere. Commodities doubled. It was just happy days.
And were Trump voters, or the kind of voters who are supporting these populist parties, would they benefit from such a boom? I mean, some people might watch this and think, hey, you've got a successful investor on your show who's talking about returns on capital.
Talking his own book.
That sounds like the kind of evil globalist guys who are just trying to maximize revenue and minimize friction. What about people who want jobs in local communities? Will they benefit from such a boom?
That's why I say we have to wait for the next 6 months. First, if we do get a Mar-a-Lago Accord and what this Mar-a-Lago Accord looks like. If part of this Mar-a-Lago Accord is telling BYD, look, you're going to open a plant in Ohio, telling Li Autos, look, you're opening a plant in Tennessee, and telling Longhorn Machinery, you're opening a plant in Iowa, like was done in the mid-'80s to Toyota, to Mercedes, and said, you want to sell here, you have to produce here, then the working class in that Rust Belt that has been decimated by the unrivaled free trade of the past 20 years might stand a fighting chance, for sure.
Is this the West kind of getting its act together in its strategic competition with China? How does all of this so-called rightward shift, if some of it at least happens, and of course we'll have a lot of surprises in coming years, exactly what you and I have just described is probably not exactly what will happen, but if some of it happens, how does that affect the underlying sort of power struggle between China and the West?
So I don't think this rightward shift is linked to China. This rightward shift is linked to inflation. It's because inflation is accelerated everywhere that people have said, you know what, I don't want any of this anymore. Inflation, again, is the kryptonite of political careers. Inflation is the reason you had a 16-point swing in people who earn less than $50,000 a year towards Donald Trump. And that was the swing that won him the election. Inflation was the catalyst, not whatever China does. Partly because what China does remains highly deflationary for the world. All of a sudden, you and I, unless we're living in a Western country, but if we're living in an emerging market country, we can buy like Chinese cars for $10,000 a year now. We can buy Chinese smartphones for $400-500 a year instead of $1,000. Like the big story from China of the past 5 years, the one that people have missed, the one that you and I have discussed before, is that while everybody was focusing on their real estate bust, they missed that China was leapfrogging the West in industry after industry. It's leapfrogged the West in the production of cars, in the production of trains, in the production of turbines, of industrial robots, you name it, of batteries, solar panels. And so now we're living into a world where China is now the industrial superpower. Essentially, the US is now the digital superpower, and China is the industrial superpower. And what the US did was try to trip up China by saying, look, we're not going to give you access to semiconductors, and it's going to screw up your economy. And what it ended up doing is putting the Chinese economy on a war footing where all the resources went at double speed, double pace to building up its own independence on every single vertical. And so now our ability to hurt China is actually now gone. Chinese exports to the US have gone from 8% of Chinese GDP when Trump first came in 8 years ago to less than 2% today. So Trump's ability to trip up China is pretty much gone at this point. So the way we have to consider the world we're in is, look, China's now the industrial superpower. Do we A, try to catch up? Do we B, accept it and trade with China on these terms? And if the US is the digital superpower and China's the industrial superpower, what does that leave for the rest of us?
Well, what's the answer to that question? Because earlier you were telling us if they make deals with Mercedes and these producers that they've got to have factories on US soil, that could be great for voters.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what will happen. Trump wants to be, and he said this time and again, and that's the big difference with the Biden administration. Trump said, look, China's a competitor, it's not an enemy. I want BYD to have factories in the US. For Trump, whether the factory says BYD or Toyota doesn't matter. What he cares about is the jobs inside. For Biden, the idea of a BYD factory in the United States was anathema.
You haven't given up on the idea of reindustrializing to some extent.
The deindustrialization is a big problem. Now, if you're a politician, there's two things. Do you want to solve the problem, or do you want to be seen to be solving the problem? If you can't solve the problem, which I don't think we can, I don't think we can compete with China is the simple reality. If you can't solve the problem, you at least want to be seen to be solving the problem. And, forcing BYD to open a plant in the United States, that's something. So I need to do something, and that's something, so I'll do that. And that's what will happen. That's what the Mar-a-Lago Accord will be about. It'll be about to be seen to be solving a problem. Will it solve it fundamentally? It won't. Because China's industrial might is now well past the point where we can catch up.
So if we were coming to you for investment advice, obviously in an unofficial capacity, and if people are sitting on their $100 of savings here in the beginning of January and thinking, what should they do with them? What is going to do well in this year and next year? I love these ones because then I can get you back in 2 years' time and see whether you're right or wrong.
And say, why was I such a fool? Well, here's something that most people don't realize. What is the one major stock market that outperformed the U.S. stock market this past year? And the answer is China. What is the only bond market in the world that has outperformed every other bond market every year for the past 5 years? And that's the Chinese bond market. So when you look around the world today, in China, you have very low interest rates, like lowest on history for China, lowest relative to anywhere in the world in history. So very, very low interest rates, and a government that is actively stimulating. That is, saying, I want to get growth faster. I'm going to do fiscal easing. I'm going to do monetary policy easing. And you've got valuations on stocks that are not at record lows, but that are very cheap. Now, this setup is about as good a setup as you can get. A government that's got your back, super low interest rates, and super low valuations, that's a good setup.
Unless there's a war.
Unless there's a war. Yeah. But wars are bad anywhere. But But by the way, if there's a China war,
yeah,
gonna be
the
tough
stock
for
market's
everybody.
the least of our worries. Louis, we could go on all day. We started with Canada, ended up in China. I think we could go around the world a few more times. As always, a pleasure to hear from you. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks again, Freddie. Great to see you.
That was Louis-Vincent Gave, the investor, economist, and political observer. We kind of got carried away a little bit there. We were supposed to talk about Canada, but kept widening the scope and ended up talking about the Chinese stock market. That's probably my fault, but as always, interesting and stimulating. I hope you enjoyed it as I did. This was UnHerd.